Okay, I'm going to look at another example. This one I'm going to call multiples. Write a class multiples that will ask the user to input 2 integers and determine if the first integer is a multiple of the second. So this is slightly different than before. We're not randomly generating integers. We're going to get user input. If I look at sort of the idea here, pseudocode-wise, we have to get the first number, call it A, get the second number, call it B. As we get input from the user, we want to make sure that that input is accurate, the accurate type of input. So we'll use a console look ahead for these, console.hasNext integer. Once we have those numbers, a number A will be a multiple of B if, when you do the modular division, you get 0. But you have to be kind of careful because you cannot divide by 0. So that B would have to not be 0. So what we'll do is we'll say that our code will prompt for a new value for B unless if B is 0 and A is 0. If they're both 0, in which case A would still be a multiple of B. So how we handle that special case of the second number being 0 could vary, but in this problem, we'll say to keep prompting for a new B unless they're both 0, in which case the problem is also then done. Okay, so let's go over to Eclipse and start a new class. I'm still in chapter 5. Call it multiples, or just multiple. What did it say to call it? Let's see. Oh, multiples, okay. I'm gonna set up some comments briefly. Mainly just with a date. Maybe describe what this program does. So a class that asks the user to input 2 integers and determines if the first integer is a multiple of the second. I'm going to need a console, and I'm also going to need something else. So we're going to import java.utility.everything. So at least for my scanner, that's all right, we'll leave it there. We have the import. Okay, I'll come down here to main. I'm going to get the integers A and B. So integer A equals get integer, let's call that method from the user, and integer B equals get integer from the user. And maybe we'll just set up a method that prints those guys out. I really just need to test it once. So let's just see if we can get an integer and then print it out. So we'll set up a method for that. Print, sorry, public static This method, we want it to return the integer they get from the user, so it's type integer, get integer, has no parameters, and it's going to return an integer. So I'm just going to set up a returning of -1, sort of a default return value. Okay, so my logic so far is strong. If I run this, it should print the number -1, and it does. You know, just setting up, is my logic make sense? Does my logic make sense? Okay, so now what's involved in getting the integer? We're going to need a scanner. We're going to need to print something. So maybe tell the user enter an integer. And it's not a print line, it's just a print. And now we want to do a scanner console look ahead. So we're going to say, well, console.has next. Well, we'd like it to have a next integer, but we're going to say if it's not, if the next thing is not an integer, do two things. Read that thing in, get rid of it, and then print another prompt, invalid entry. Maybe make this a print line. Invalid entry, and then we'll put that other prompt in, enter an integer. So I can kind of feel like this prompt is happening, this enter an integer is happening several times here. We may want to up here and have a string called prompt. But this is called enter an integer. And then in these print statements, you can just print that prompt. It saves us a little bit of repetitiveness. Another way to handle that would be to have that prompt come in as a parameter here, but I don't think we're going to use it anywhere else, so I think it's fine where it is. Well, console does not have an integer. Take what it has and get rid of it. Tell the user it's an invalid entry, prompt again, and then it's going to keep doing that until it has an integer. So then once it has an integer, we want to return that integer. So we're returning console.next. Integer, sorry. So while it doesn't have an integer, keep prompting for a new one and keep checking if the new one is an integer until it is an integer, and then return that integer. So I should run this and make sure that my code for get integer is working. Enter an integer and enter my name in. Oh, it didn't like that. Invalid entry. Enter an integer. Let's enter in 1.5. Doesn't like that. Enter an integer, 12. And then it does like 12. Okay, so going back to main, we don't just need one integer. We need two integers. And then let's go back to our, so we could, I know if it works once, it'll work twice, so I'm not gonna do that, test that. Let's go back to our pseudocode for a second. So we wanna check if A is a multiple of B, but in order to do that, we need to make sure that B is not 0. Or take care of this special case. So, you know, maybe I sort of put pseudocode in here that says if B does not equal 0, well, I would want to call the method is multiple of. Is multiple, and is multiple will get the parameters A and B. And let's think about what is multiple type is going to be. And let's call it, let's write it out a little more clearly. Is a multiple of. You put an underscore in there. Yeah. Is a multiple of. Or just is multiple of. There we go. So this method is multiple of will be of type Boolean. We want it to be true or false. Is it a multiple of? Yes or no. So down here we can say if is multiple of, then we can put a print statement. Let's use formatted printing. %d is a multiple of %d period, comma. Okay, so we want A is a multiple of B. So A would come first, and then B would come after it. And then I would need to define this method is multiple of. So I'll do that right below here. And I think I'll do it below get integer. Public, static. Okay, what type is it? It's type Boolean. Is multiple of integer A, integer B, and then let's just return false or true. Make sure our logic is working. So back up here, if it is a multiple of, if A is a multiple of B, print out A is a multiple of B. Otherwise, so you put an else in here, else, let's print it's really the same thing, but it's going to say A is not a multiple of B. So we're going to go %B is not a multiple of %D, A comma B. So right now, if we ran it to test the logic, what would happen? We're going to be entering 2 integers. It's not checking whether B is 0 or not, so we have to make sure that the second integer we enter is not 0. Well, we don't actually have to do that because the is multiple of is always going to return false. So the result should print out the first number is not a multiple of the second number, regardless. Let's try it. Enter an integer, 10. Enter an integer, 25. 10 is not a multiple of 25. Oh, I notice here there's no period at the end of that sentence. Period in at the end of that sentence. Okay. So even if it was a multiple of it, it wouldn't work because it is a multiple of is returning a false value. Okay. So we are assuming that B is not 0. So what if A is 0? Or what if A and B? So when can B be 0? I can't do this, A% B, unless we're sure that A is not 0. Or I'm sorry, B is not 0. But if B is 0 and A is 0, then A would be a multiple of B. So let's go back up to our main for a second. Here I said if B is not 0. So let's look at our pseudocode again. What if B is 0? So if B is 0 and A is 0, we cannot have error. So we need to be sure that B is not 0. So, and we'll prompt for a new B if it is, unless A is also 0. So that's a little tricky. So I'm going to do a while loop here. While B is not equal to 0, or no, while B does equal 0, and A does not equal 0. So that would mean that B is 0, but A is not. So that would mean we need to get another value for B. So we're going to print um, 0 is the only multiple of 0. And then we'll set up another value for B equals get integer. So that will continue to get a B until either B is not 0 or both A and B are 0. And then we'll run this test, is multiple of. So we come into is multiple of. So I should check this. Let's run it. Enter an integer 120. Enter an integer 0. 0 is the only multiple of 0. Enter an integer 12. 120 is not a multiple of 12. Well, we know 120 is a multiple of 12, but I haven't written that code yet. So the logic looks like it's working. Come into is multiple of. So now, the only way we get here where B is 0 is if both A and B are 0. So if, well, what if A is 0? If A is 0, 0 is a multiple of everything. So if the number you're starting with is 0 for A, this is a multiple of would always need to return true. And then if that's not true, I could set up an else statement, or think about we're never going to get here if that if statement is not is true. It's just going to be returning true. We're done. Then the only way we get down to this line is if A is not 0. And now we want to say return the value of A% B equals 0. If you do the modular division, A divided by B equals 0. If that's true, then is returning true. If that's false, that's returning false. And it should be all of our code. Notice, that there is some weird work here around the zero, in which position 0 is. Let's go back and run it, make sure it works, then I'll show the code again. Enter an integer. Let's enter 0 and 0. 0 is a multiple of 0. Perfect. Run it again. We'll let A be 0 and B be 232. 0 is a multiple of 232. In fact, 0 is a multiple of everything. Run it again with 1 and 0, and it should say, oh, 0 is the only multiple of 0. Enter another integer. So let's enter in 12. And 1 is not a multiple of 12. And let's run it again. Let's go with 2000. Let's enter in 25. 2000 is a multiple of 25. So it appears that it's working. I'm going to go back and show you the code again. Think about the logic. Come into main, we get an integer for A, we get an integer for B. If B is 0 but A is not, or while that scenario is true, it's going to keep generating a new value for B. So we want to make sure that either B is not 0 or they're both 0. That's what that's doing. And then when we call is a multiple of, that function should return true if A is a multiple of B. So if that is true, print A is a multiple of B. If it is not true, print A is not a multiple of B. And then here's our methods downstairs. So notice, main has some logic in it. Main has this while loop, main has this if-else statement, but then within main, we're calling these other methods. So get integer, ask the user to enter an integer. While the console does not have an integer, so this is while has next integer means it would have an integer. While it's not an integer, keep getting another integer. So we're going to use that type of look ahead frequently when we're getting input from the user to make sure that their input is the right kind of input. And then that'll get the input, the integers, and returns it. And then we have our last is a multiple of. If the first number is 0, always return true, because 0 is a multiple of everything. Otherwise, return the value of this conditional statement. If the modular division is 0, that means if that's true, then A is a multiple of B. If it's false, then A is not a multiple of B. Okay, so the last thing would be to sort of put in some pre and post comments and to describe what these methods are doing. So get integer, there's no pre-conditions. Post condition is this should return an integer. Is multiple of has a precondition. So this is going to return true if A is a multiple of B. The preconditions here are that A and B are both integers, and B is not 0 unless both A and B are 0. And I guess actually the post condition is the value it's returning. Returns true if A is a multiple of B, and false otherwise. Okay, so that's the code that asks, so the difference between this guy and the previous thing was, in the previous one, we were randomly generating numbers and determining if they were multiples of a given number or 10. In this example, those numbers are coming from the user, and then we're determining if the first number is a multiple of the second number, revisiting the code in general, get the first integer, get the second integer. If they're not both 0, keep getting another second integer. If this Boolean is true, print output that there is a multiple. If it's not true, print the output that it's not true. That's our main. Getting an integer, set up a prompt so I didn't have to repeat this code, and then print the prompt. While the console does not have an integer, keep looking on the console until you do. That's a very common way of getting the right kind of input, and then return that integer. And then is a multiple of, if the first number is 0, return true. So notice that takes into account the case that they're both 0, so we don't have to worry about dividing by 0 here. And we just return the value of this conditional statement, which is true when A is a multiple of B and false otherwise. So there's the two methods, and you can pause if you needed that. Back up here is main. I will post this multiples again on Canvas and the video as well.